On a chilly November evening, the silence of the neighborhood was shattered in a way that would haunt it for years. At the center of this tragedy were Claire and David Whitfield. Claire, a 42-year-old former teacher, was known for her warm smile and quiet nature. David, 44, a successful real estate agent, had a reputation for being charming and personable. Together, they appeared to have the perfect life, until it all fell apart. Their marriage had once been strong, but the years had taken their toll. David's work consumed him, leaving little time for Claire. She found herself lonely, especially after their 2 kids had gone off to college. Then, one summer evening, she discovered the texts, flirty messages between David and one of his clients. It didn't take long for her to piece together the late nights and weekend meetings. Claire was devastated, but she buried her feelings, trying to convince herself that confronting David would solve nothing. But as the weeks passed, resentment festered. Every smile from David felt like a taunt. Every, "I'm working late tonight," a reminder of his betrayal. Her anger grew into a quiet, smoldering rage. She began to fantasize about ways to make him pay. But it wasn't until one night in late October that the idea of a final, terrifying act took root in her mind. On the night of November 10th, Claire put her plan into motion. She invited David to a special dinner, claiming she wanted to rekindle their relationship. He accepted, oblivious to the storm brewing behind her calm demeanor. The dinner was set: candles, soft music, and a meal of David's favorite dishes. He arrived, expecting a pleasant evening, maybe even an apology for the tension between them. Instead, Claire handed him a glass of his favorite whiskey, laced with just enough sedatives to make him woozy but conscious. She watched as his expression shifted from confusion to fear. "What's this, Claire?" he slurred, as the room seemed to tilt around him. She smiled, but it was a smile devoid of warmth. "I know, David. I know everything." He tried to get up, but his legs buckled. Claire caught him, guiding him down into the chair. "You think you can just walk away from what you've done?" she asked, her voice a cold whisper. "You think I'll just let you humiliate me?" As David struggled to stay awake, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small kitchen knife, sharp and glinting in the candlelight. His eyes widened with realization, but the sedatives made his movements slow, his voice a faint plea. But Claire didn't stab him. Instead, she leaned in close, pressing the blade against his cheek just enough to draw a thin line of blood. "You always thought you could do whatever you wanted," she murmured. "But tonight, I'm in control." David's breaths came in shallow, panicked gasps. He knew Claire's hurt, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. He tried to reason with her, promising that they could fix things, that he would change. But Claire's mind was already made up. She stood up and circled the chair slowly, like a predator toying with its prey. Then she whispered in his ear, "You've taken everything from me. Now I'll take everything from you." With one swift movement, she pulled back and plunged the knife into his chest. David gasped, a gurgling sound escaping his lips as blood soaked his shirt. He slumped forward, the life draining from his eyes as Claire watched, her expression a mask of grim satisfaction. As the last breath left his body, she stepped back, the reality of what she had done settling in. The house was eerily quiet, except for the sound of her own rapid breathing. She sank to the floor beside him, cradling the knife in her hands, staring at his lifeless form. For a brief moment, she thought about calling the police, spinning a story of self-defense or an intruder. But deep down, she knew there was no escaping the truth. This had been planned, deliberate, and she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Hours later, the police arrived after a neighbor reported the sound of a struggle. They found Claire sitting on the living room floor, David's body still slumped in the dining chair, blood pooling around him. Claire did not resist when they handcuffed her. Her face was calm, almost serene, as they led her away from the life she had destroyed with her own hands. As the patrol car drove her through the neighborhood, Claire stared out the window at the quiet, unsuspecting houses. For a moment, she wondered what her life would have been like if she had simply walked away from David's betrayal. But then she shook her head, pushing the thought away. It didn't matter anymore. What was done could never be undone. Claire sat in the cold gray interrogation room, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across her face. Hours had passed since the police arrived at her home. Her wrists ached from the handcuffs, but she remained stoic, replaying the evening over and over in her mind. A part of her felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted, but it was overshadowed by the looming realization of what she had done. Detective Harper, a seasoned officer with a weary look in his eyes, entered the room and sat across from her. He placed a small recorder between them, clicked it on, and leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Claire Whitfield, we're recording this interview for the record. Do you understand why you're here?" Claire nodded, her expression blank. "I know what I did." Harper studied her, searching for any sign of remorse or regret, but all he saw was exhaustion, perhaps a hint of something else, a defiant calm that made him uneasy. "Why don't you tell me what happened tonight?" he prompted, his tone surprisingly gentle. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "I killed him, Detective. It wasn't an accident." The bluntness of her admission caught him off guard, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He had expected lies, a twisted story of self-defense, but not this. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain his professional composure. "You need to be more specific, Claire. What led up to it? Why did you feel the need to do this?" Claire hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. "I found out he was cheating on me," she began, her voice flat and detached. "Months ago. I kept quiet, tried to pretend it didn't bother me. But it did. Every single day, it ate away at me. I couldn't look at him without feeling hate." Harper jotted down notes, though he barely glanced at the pad. He was more focused on the way she spoke, the chilling lack of emotion behind each word. "So, you planned this?" he asked. "The dinner? The sedatives? That was all part of your plan?" She nodded again. "Yes. I knew he'd accept the invitation, that he'd let his guard down. He always did when he thought he was in control. But tonight, he wasn't." Harper leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Claire, you know what you're saying here, don't you? This is premeditated murder. You could be looking at life in prison, maybe worse. And yet, you don't seem afraid. Why?" Claire's lips twitched, almost forming a bitter smile. "What do I have left to be afraid of, Detective? My life ended when I realized the man I thought I knew, the life I thought I had, was all a lie. Tonight was just cleaning up the mess." The detective paused, letting her words hang in the air. He'd heard a lot of stories over the years, tales of broken homes and shattered dreams, but something about Claire's quiet acceptance disturbed him more than the violence itself. It was as though she had come to terms with her fate long before she ever picked up the knife. He switched off the recorder and rose to his feet, signaling to the officers outside. "We're done here for now," he said, casting one last look at Claire before heading for the door. "Take her back to holding." 2 officers escorted Claire out of the room, their grip on her arms firm, but not rough. As she shuffled down the hallway in her restraints, Claire caught a glimpse of herself in the reflection of a passing window. A gaunt, haunted woman, unrecognizable from the vibrant person she once had been. For a brief moment, the gravity of what she'd done washed over her, and she felt a pang of fear. But she forced it down, refusing to let herself feel weak. As she sat alone in the holding cell, time seemed to stretch endlessly. The distant hum of police radios and the shuffle of footsteps outside her door were the only sounds breaking the silence. Claire stared at the concrete floor, wondering if David's mistress knew what had happened yet, if she'd feel some twisted sense of guilt. The thought brought no satisfaction, only a dull emptiness. Meanwhile, back at the Whitfield house, the police processed the scene with methodical precision. Flashing lights painted the suburban street in shades of red and blue, while neighbors whispered to each other from behind drawn curtains. Yellow tape marked the boundaries of a shattered home. Inside, the remnants of the Whitfields' final dinner lay scattered across the dining table, a stark reminder of a life that had gone violently off course. Detective Harper lingered in the doorway, surveying the scene. The neatly set table, the candles that had burned down to nubs, the blood-soaked chair where David had taken his last breath. It was a scene of contradictions, careful planning and sudden brutality, love turned to hatred in the span of a heartbeat. He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair, then headed outside to brief the forensic team. They would be there all night, collecting evidence, piecing together the story that Claire had already confessed to. But Harper couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered in the air, a question left unanswered. As the night deepened, the first snow of the season began to fall, covering the street in a thin layer of white. It was quiet, almost serene, a stark contrast to the turmoil that had unfolded inside the Whitfield home. Claire watched the flakes drift past the barred window of her cell, wondering if she would ever feel that kind of peace again. In the days following her arrest, Claire's story dominated the local news. Reporters lingered outside the county jail, eager for a glimpse of the woman at the center of the scandal. The media painted her as a jealous wife, a spurned lover turned killer, and the town devoured every detail. But inside her cell, Claire remained isolated from the storm she had created. Her only company, the thoughts that haunted her at night. Detective Harper, however, had little time for the media circus. He spent his days reviewing evidence and trying to fill in the gaps of that fateful evening. He combed through text messages, bank records, and social media posts, seeking clues to David's secret life. But the deeper he dug, the more he wondered if Claire's story was as straightforward as she claimed. One detail nagged at him: the sedatives. According to the toxicology report, David had ingested far more than just the whiskey Claire had spiked. The dosage was high enough to render him nearly unconscious before she even picked up the knife. Harper couldn't shake the feeling that there might be more to this, that someone else could have had a role in setting the scene that night. But Claire remained adamant. She alone had planned it, and she alone had acted. On the 5th day after her arrest, Claire was summoned back to the interrogation room. This time, Harper brought along a thin folder, its contents carefully chosen. He placed it on the table between them, then leaned forward, meeting her eyes. "We've gone through your house, your phone records, your financials," he said, watching her closely. "And there's something that doesn't add up. The level of sedatives in David's system, it was enough to knock out a grown man for hours. But from what you've told us, you just wanted him drowsy, not completely unconscious." Claire's expression didn't change, but Harper caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps fear. He pressed on. "If there's something you're not telling me, Claire, now's the time." You don't want this going to trial with unanswered questions hanging over your head. She hesitated, her fingers clenching and unclenching in her lap. For the first time, her calm facade seemed to crack. I didn't give him that much. I just wanted him weak, to make sure he couldn't fight back. Harper's brow furrowed. Then how do you explain the dosage? Claire shook her head, her voice wavering. I don't know. I swear, I don't know. He had a prescription for sleeping pills, but I never touched them. She looked down, her expression desperate, as if willing herself to find an explanation. Maybe he took them himself, before he came home. Maybe he knew what I was planning, and he wanted. Her voice trailed off, the implication hanging between them. Harper scribbled a note on his pad, but remained skeptical. You're saying David might have known you were going to kill him, and he just accepted it? That doesn't make sense, Claire. She met his gaze, a glint of defiance returning. Maybe he thought he deserved it. Harper leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. He glanced down at the folder, then back at Claire, weighing his options. He could push harder, try to break through her defenses, but something told him that if she hadn't cracked by now, she wouldn't do it easily. I'll be straight with you, Claire, he said, his tone softening. Whether you planned this alone or not, the prosecution's building a solid case. They'll paint you as cold, calculating, and they'll use your confession to make sure you never see the outside of a prison cell again. Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. She seemed to consider his words, her shoulders slumping slightly under the weight of the truth. What do you want me to say, detective? I told you what happened. I've got nothing else. Harper closed the folder, a sense of frustration gnawing at him. He had been hoping for a break, a revelation that might shift the narrative. But Claire seemed determined to carry the full burden of guilt, even if it meant sealing her own fate. A few weeks later, Claire's trial began in the county courthouse. The courtroom was packed with spectators eager for the drama to unfold. On one side, the prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Elena Graves, delivered her opening statement with precision, painting Claire as a calculating murderer, driven by jealousy and rage. She displayed photos of the crime scene, the blood-stained dining room, the knife that had ended David's life. On the other side, Claire sat beside her defense attorney, a weary public defender, who seemed overwhelmed by the media frenzy. He argued that Claire had acted in the heat of the moment, that David's betrayal had pushed her beyond reason. But the jury's eyes kept drifting back to the photos, to the image of the knife lying in the pool of David's blood. When it was Claire's turn to testify, the courtroom held its breath. She spoke in the same detached tone she had used with Detective Harper, recounting her discovery of David's affair, the months of pain and resentment, and the moment she decided that she couldn't endure it any longer. Her voice remained steady, even as she described the moment she plunged the knife into his chest, the last breath leaving his lips. But when the prosecutor questioned her about the sedatives, pressing her on the unexplained overdose, Claire's composure wavered. She stumbled over her answers, insisting that she had only given him a small dose. Her uncertainty was obvious, and the jury exchanged uneasy glances, sensing a shadow of doubt in her story. The trial dragged on for 2 tense weeks, with witnesses called, evidence dissected, and legal arguments made. But in the end, it came down to one thing: Claire's confession. Her own words sealed her fate, and after a day of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. As the judge delivered her sentence, 25 years to life, Claire stood in silence, her hands clasped in front of her. She didn't flinch when the gavel struck, nor did she look back at the courtroom packed with curious faces. But when she glanced toward the back of the room, she caught sight of a familiar figure. Elena Graves, the prosecutor, watching her with a strange expression. And beside her, a man in a dark coat, his face half hidden in the shadows. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She recognized him, a lawyer who had been working for David's real estate firm, a man she had seen leaving their house late one night, months before she discovered the affair. She felt a chill run down her spine as his eyes met hers, a fleeting smirk curling at the corner of his lips. Before she could react, the bailiff took her by the arm and led her away, the courtroom doors swinging shut behind her. But as she descended into the dim, echoing corridors beneath the courthouse, a new fear gripped her. Had she truly known everything about David's secret life? Or was there another layer, hidden beneath the surface, that she had been blind to until it was too late? As Claire was led through the cold concrete corridors of the courthouse, a sense of dread settled over her. The brief glimpse of the man in the dark coat, the smirk that flashed across his face, played over and over in her mind. It felt like a shadowy piece of the puzzle she had been missing. But there was no time to dwell on it. The judge's gavel had fallen, and her fate was sealed. That night, in the cramped cell of the county jail, she lay awake on the hard cot, staring up at the ceiling. Her mind kept drifting back to that moment in the courtroom. The lawyer, David's old associate. Why had he been there? And why did he look so smug? It seemed impossible that he could have anything to do with what had happened between her and David. But the thought gnawed at her. The next morning, Claire's lawyer visited her, bringing an unexpected development. "The prosecutor, Elena Graves, requested a meeting with you," he said, his voice low. "She said it's urgent, but I don't know why. You're already convicted." Claire's pulse quickened. She nodded, and an hour later she found herself in a small windowless room, facing Graves across a metal table. The prosecutor's usual cold demeanor was replaced with something softer, more reluctant. "I don't normally do this, Claire," Graves began, her eyes narrowing as she studied the woman in front of her. "But there's something you should know before you get shipped off. I thought the trial would give me the satisfaction of seeing justice served. But I have doubts." Claire's hands tightened into fists. "What do you mean?" Graves pulled out a manila folder and slid it across the table. "During the investigation, we found some inconsistencies in David's financial records, large withdrawals that didn't match his typical spending patterns. And his associate, Richard Holt, the man you saw in the courtroom, he's tied to them. They had a business venture together, something off the books. A few people have suggested David might have been laundering money." Claire's breath caught. "Why didn't you bring this up during the trial?" Graves let out a bitter laugh. "Because it wasn't relevant to the case against you. And frankly, I thought it would muddy the waters, make you look sympathetic to the jury. But now I'm not so sure that David's death was all about your revenge." Claire frowned, leaning forward. "What are you saying, Elena?" "I'm saying that the levels of sedatives in his system didn't match your story, and it's possible someone else had a hand in this. Someone who stood to gain from David's death." Richard Holt's name came up more than once during interviews with David's clients. It's possible he was setting up David to take the fall for their dirty dealings. And if David found out, maybe Richard saw an opportunity when you did what you did. Claire's mind reeled as the pieces fell into place. "You think he might have drugged David before I got to him? Made sure he couldn't fight back, so I'd be blamed?" Graves shrugged, her expression turning hard again. "Maybe. Or maybe he just got lucky when you decided to end it. Either way, Holt's keeping his distance. but he's been acting too calm through all of this. If you were willing to testify, it might reopen the investigation, but it won't change your sentence." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She considered the prosecutor's words, the image of Holt's smirk flashing through her mind again. She thought about how she had carried the full weight of David's death, believing herself to be the sole architect of the tragedy. Now, a new possibility emerged, one that made her realize just how much she had been manipulated, how easily her rage had been used against her. She shook her head slowly, a small, mirthless smile on her lips. "No, Elena, it's too late for me. I'm where I deserve to be. But if Richard Holt had a part in this, you need to find out. He doesn't get to walk away." Graves studied her, searching for any sign of deception, but Claire's eyes were clear, resolute. After a moment, the prosecutor nodded and rose from her seat, gathering the folder. "I'll see what I can do. But don't think this changes anything for you, Claire. You still chose to end his life." Claire watched her leave, the door swinging shut behind her, and felt a strange sense of closure. She knew she couldn't undo what she had done, couldn't bring back the part of herself that died the moment she drove the knife into David's chest. But the thought that Richard Holt might face justice, that David's betrayal hadn't been the only lie in her life, offered a glimmer of solace. 6 months later, Claire sat in the common area of the state penitentiary, staring out at the snowy landscape beyond the barred windows. Life had settled into a routine: chores, meals, quiet evenings alone with her thoughts. But today, a small ripple had disturbed the monotony. A guard had slipped her a newspaper, folded open to a local news article. Real estate lawyer Richard Holt, indicted for fraud and money laundering. The headline was bold, the details sparse, but it was enough for Claire. She read about the investigation that had uncovered his illicit dealings, how authorities believed he had manipulated David in their schemes. There was a single line that made her pause. Suspicions remain about Holt's involvement in the events leading up to David Whitfield's death, but no charges have been filed. A faint, bitter laugh escaped her lips as she read those words. She thought of David, of the life they had built, and the lies that had torn it apart. She thought of Holt, maneuvering behind the scenes, turning her own desperate act into his gain. In the end, she realized, she had been both the avenger and the pawn, caught in a web of secrets she had never fully understood. She folded the newspaper carefully and handed it back to the guard. As she turned to walk back to her cell, the heavy door clanged shut behind her, a final echo of the life she had left behind. But for the first time since that fateful night, Claire felt a strange sense of peace. She knew she would never escape the consequences of her actions, but at least, in some small way, she had helped to bring the truth to light. And as the prison yard filled with the quiet murmur of inmates around her, Claire allowed herself a small, defiant smile. The snow fell softly outside, covering the ground in a fresh white blanket, and she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in months, a sense of control, of finally understanding the true story behind her own tragedy.